We're going to start talking about figures of speech and literary devices. There are many figures of speech. I'm going to introduce you to 4 of them today. That will include simile, metaphor, personification, and illusion. We are going to look for these 4 figures of speech in an essay titled Under the Influence by Scott Russell Sanders. And then we are going to look for these 4 figures of speech in Kafka's Metamorphosis, parts 1 through 3. The content of this presentation is as follows. We will learn about the figures of speech. We will look at definitions and examples. Then I will read Under the Influence. While I am reading Under the Influence, you need to print this essay out. While I'm reading Under the Influence, you need to practice identifying the figures of speech. All right, so what is a figure of speech? A figure of speech is a phrase or word having different meanings than its literal meanings. Using the figures of speech improves writing, making it more vivid. For example, I could say in a piece of writing, it was cold, right? It was cold, but that doesn't pack as much. It doesn't make as much of an impact as saying, It was as cold as an ancient crypt in a long forgotten graveyard. This is a simile. This is much more powerful. I'm still saying that it's cold, but at this point I am painting a picture for my readers to imagine in their mind. Therefore, they are able to connect with the writing on a more personal level. So the second one is the more powerful statement. So we're going to look at 4 figures of speech. The first one is simile. Make sure you're taking notes and you get your definitions down for sure. The first one is simile. A simile is a stated comparison. So a simile is a comparison, usually formed with like or as between 2 fundamentally dissimilar things that have certain qualities in common. So a simile is a comparison that uses like or as. An example of a simile would be, Roberto was white as a sheet after he walked out of the horror movie. You see that word as there? He was white as a sheet. That makes this comparison a simile. Metaphor, an implied comparison. So again, a simile is a comparison. A metaphor is a comparison. Simile uses like or as, metaphor does not. An implied comparison between 2 dissimilar things that have something in common. For example, Shakespeare's famous line from the play As You Like It, all the world is a stage. This is an example of a metaphor. The third is illusion. Illusion is a reference to a literary work of some kind. So, for example, if I were to say he had Herculean strength, I'm referring to the story of Hercules. What I'm saying is he's strong. Right? He's strong, but it is more meaningful and more vivid to say he had Herculean strength than to just say he was strong. Finally, personification. This figure is a figure of speech in which an inanimate object or abstraction is endowed with human qualities or abilities. An inanimate object is endowed with human qualities or abilities. For example, that kitchen knife will take a bite out of your hand if you don't handle it safely. We know that kitchen knives can't literally bite, right? So this is giving the inanimate object of the kitchen knife a human characteristic of being able to bite. So again, the 4 figures of speech that we're looking at today: simile, comparison using like or as; metaphor, comparison between 2 dissimilar things that have something in common; illusion, a reference to a literary work; personification, giving inanimate objects human characteristics. Your assignment for Module 3 is as follows. So we have step 1, simile, step 2, metaphor, step 3, personification, and step 4, illusion. For each one of these steps, you're going to do the following. First, you're going to print the essay under the influence, and you're going to follow along as I read it to you. Second, you're going to underline or highlight the 4 figures of speech in the essay as you see them. That is simile, metaphor, illusion, personification. You're going to label each one of them. So you've got that text printed out, you're highlighting, you're underlining, you're writing on the essay. The next thing you're going to do in the assignment box in Module 3, you're going to identify topic, main idea, and theme. Remember, we went over topic, main idea, and theme in Module 1. Topic is what is the text about, 1 to 2 words, right? We talked about how the topic for the metamorphosis could be change, right? 1 to 2 words, change. What is the main idea of the passage? That is, what is the author's opinion on the topic? What is Kafka's opinion on change? Is it beneficial? Is it detrimental? And then theme, what is the lesson? The life lesson, the universal life lesson presented by the author through his or her writing. So it applies to all people in all places at all times. It's a lesson. Then in the second assignment box, you're going to list 3 to 5 examples of simile, metaphor, and illusion from Under the Influence. So step 2, when you're underlining and highlighting, if you do a really thorough job here, then step 4 is going to be easier for you. So 3 to 5 examples of simile, metaphor, and illusion. List 2 examples of personification. Then explain what makes each example that particular figure of speech. Why is this a metaphor? Why is this a simile? Okay, and again, you're still identifying in the previous assignment, step 3, topic, main idea, and theme. So thinking along those lines. All right, follow along with the reading, underlining and highlighting, and labeling the figures of speech we have learned today. Be able to identify topic, main idea, and theme, as well as simile, metaphor, illusion, and personification. So let's take a look at this essay. Under the Influence by Scott Russell Sanders. My father drank. He drank as a gut-punch boxer gasps for breath, as a starving dog gobbles food, compulsively, secretly, in pain and trembling. I use the past tense not because he never quit drinking, but because he quit living. That is how the story ends for my father, age 64, heart bursting, body cooling, and forsaken on the linoleum of my brother's trailer. The story continues for my brother, my sister, my mother, and me, and will continue so long as memory holds. In the perennial present of memory, I slip into the garage or barn to see my father tipping back the flat green bottles of wine, the brown cylinders of whiskey, the cans of beer disguised in paper bags. His Adam's apple bobs the liquid gurgles. He wipes the sandy-haired back of a hand over his lips, and then, his bloodshot gaze bumping into me, he stashes the bottle or can inside his jacket under the workbench between 2 bales of hay, and we both pretend the moment has not occurred. What's up, buddy, he says, thick-tongued and edgy. Sky's up, I answer, playing along. And don't forget prices, he grumbles. Prices are always up, and taxes. In memory, his white 1951 Pontiac with the stripes down the hood and the Indian head on the snout jounces to a stop in the driveway. Or it's the 1956 Ford station wagon, or the 1963 Rambler shaped like a toad, or the sleek 1969 Bonneville that will do 120 miles per hour on straightaways. Or it is the Robin's Egg blue pickup, new in 1980, battered in 1981, the year of his death. He climbs out, grinning dangerously, unsteady on his legs, and we children interrupt our game of catch, of building snow forts, picking plums, to watch in silence as he weaves past into the house, where he slumps into his overstuffed chair and falls asleep. Shaking her head, our mother stubs out the cigarette he has left smoldering in the ashtray. All evening until our bedtimes, we tiptoe past him as if past a snoring dragon. Then we curl in our fearful sheets, listening. Eventually he wakes with a grunt. Mother slings accusations at him. He snarls back. She yells. He growls. Their voices clashing. Before long she retreats to their bedroom, sobbing. Not from the blows of fists, for he never strikes her, but from the force of words. Left alone, our father prowls the house, thumping into furniture, rummaging in the kitchen, slamming doors, turning the pages of the newspaper with a savage crackle, muttering back at the late-night drivel from television. The roof might fly off. The walls might buckle from the pressure of his rage. Whatever my brother and sister and mother may be thinking on their own rumpled pillows, I lie there hating him, loving him, fearing him, knowing I have failed him. I tell myself he drinks to ease an ache that gnaws at his belly, an ache I must have caused by disappointing him somehow, a murderous ache. I should be able to relieve by doing all my chores, earning A's in school, winning baseball games, fixing the broken washer and the burst pipes, bring in money to fill his empty wallet. He would not hide the green bottles in the toolbox, would not sneak off to the barn with a lump under his coat, would not fall asleep in the daylight, would not roar and fume, would not drink himself to death if only I were perfect. I am 42 as I write these words, and I know full well now that my father was an alcoholic, a man consumed by disease rather than by disappointment. What had seemed to me a private grief is in fact a public scourge. In the United States alone, some 10 or 15 million people share his ailment, and behind the doors they slam in fury or disgrace, countless other children tremble. I comfort myself with such knowledge, holding against the throb of memory like an ice pack against a bruise. There are keener sources of grief: poverty, racism, rape, war. I do not wish to compete for a trophy in suffering. I am only trying to understand the corrosive mixture of helplessness, responsibility, and shame that I learned to feel as the son of an alcoholic. I realize now that I did not cause my father's illness, nor could I have cured it. Yet for all this grown-up knowledge, I am still 10 years old, my own son's age, and as that boy I struggle in guilt and confusion to save my father from pain. Consider a few of our synonyms for drunk: tipsy, tight, pickled, soused, and plowed, stoned and stewed, lubricated, inebriated, juiced and sluiced, 3 sheets to the wind, in your cups, out of your mind, under the table, lit up, tanked up, wiped out, besotted, blotto bombed, and buzzed, plastered, polluted, putrefied, loaded or looped, boozy woozy, fuddled or smashed, crocked and shit-faced, corked and pissed, knockered and slosh. It is a mostly humorous lexicon, as the lore that deals with drunks and jokes in cartoons and plays, films, and television skits is largely comic. Aunt Matilda nips elderberry wine from the sideboard and burps politely during supper. Uncle Fred slouches to the table glassy-eyed, wearing a lampshade for a hat and murmuring, "Candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker." Inspired by cocktails, Mrs. Somebody recounts the events of her day in a fuzzy dialect while Mr. Somebody nibbles her ear and croons a bawdy song. On the sofa with boyfriend, daughter giggles, licking gin from her lips, and loosens the bows in her hair. Junior knocks back some brews with his chums at the Leopard Lounge and stumbles home to the wrong house. Wonders foggily why he can't locate his pajamas, and crawls naked into bed with the ugliest girl in school. The family dog slurps a neglected martini and wobbles to the nursery, where he vomits in baby's shoe. It's all great fun, but if in the audience you notice a few laughing faces turn grim when the drunk lurches on stage, don't be surprised, for these are the children of alcoholics. Over the grinning mask of Dionysus, the leering mask of Bacchus, these children cannot help seeing the bloated features of their own parents. Instead of laughing, they wince, they mourn. Instead of celebrating the drunk as one freed from constraints, they pity him as one enslaved. They refuse to believe in vino veritas, having seen their befuddled parents skid away from truth toward folly and oblivion. And so these children bite their lips until the lust staggers into the wings. My father, when drunk, was neither funny nor honest. He was pathetic, frightening, deceitful. There seemed to be a leak in him somewhere, and he poured in booze to keep from draining dry. Like a torture victim who refuses to squeal, he would never admit that he had touched a drop, not even in his last year, when he seemed to be dissolving in alcohol before our very eyes. I never knew him to lie about anything, ever, except about this one ruinous fact. Drowsy, clumsy, unable to fix a bicycle tire, throw a baseball, balance a grocery sack, or walk across the room, he was stripped of his true self by drink. In a matter of minutes, the contents of a bottle could transform a brave man into a coward, a buddy into a bully, a gifted athlete and skilled carpenter, and shrewd businessman into a bumbler. No dictionary of synonyms for drunk would soften the anguish of watching our prince turn into a frog. Father's drinking became the family secret. While growing up, we children never breathed a word of it beyond the four walls of our house. To this day, my brother and sister rarely mention it, and then only when I press them. I did not confess the ugly, bewildering fact to my wife until his wavering walk and slurred speech forced me to. Recently, on the 7th anniversary of my father's death, I asked my mother if she ever spoke of his drinking to friends. No, no, never, she replied hastily. I couldn't bear for anyone to know. The secret bores under the skin, gets in the blood, into the bone, and stays there. Long after you've supposedly been cured of malaria, the fever can flare up, the tremors can shake you. So it is with the fevers of shame. You swallow the bitter quinine of knowledge, and you learn to feel pity and compassion toward the drinker. Yet the shame lingers in your marrow, and because of the shame, anger. For a long stretch of my childhood, we lived on a military reservation in Ohio, an arsenal where bombs were stored underground in bunkers. Vintage airplanes burst into flames, and unstable artillery shells boomed nightly at the dump. We had the feeling as children that we played in a minefield where a heedless football could trigger an explosion. When father was drinking, the house too became a minefield. The least bump could set off either parent. The more he drank, the more obsessed mother became with stopping him. She hunted for bottles, counted the cash in his wallet, sniffed at his breath. Without meaning to snoop, we children blundered left and right into damning evidence. On afternoons when he came home from work sober, we flung ourselves at him for hugs and felt against our ribs the telltale lump in his coat. In the barn, we tumbled on the hay and heard beneath our sneakers the crunch of buried glass. We tugged open a drawer in his workbench, looking for screwdrivers or crescent wrenches, and spied a gleaming six-pack among the tools. Playing tag, we darted around the house just in time to see him sway on the rear stoop and heave a finished bottle into the woods. In his goodnight kiss, we smelled the cloying sweetness of clarets, the mints he chewed to camouflage his dragon's breath. I can summon up the kiss right now by recalling Theodore Roth's lines of his own father in My Papa's Waltz. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death, such waltzing was not easy. Such waltzing was hard, terribly hard, for with a boy's scrawny arms I was trying to hold my tipsy father upright. For years, the chief source of those incriminating bottles and cans was a grimy store a mile from us, a cinder block place called Sly's, with 2 gas pumps outside and a moth-eaten dog asleep in the window. A strip of flypaper speckled the year round with black bodies coiled in the doorway. Inside, on rusty metal shelves or in wheezing coolers, you could find pop and popsicles, cigarettes, potato chips, canned soup, raunchy postcards, fishing gear, Twinkies, wine, and beer. When father drove anywhere on errands, mother would send us kids along as guards, warning us not to let him out of our sight. And so with one or more of us on board, father would cruise up to Sly's, pump $1 worth of gas, or plump the tires with air, and then telling us to wait in the car, he would head for that fly-spangled doorway. Dutiful and panicked, we cried, "Let us go in with you." "No," he answered, "I'll be back in 2 shakes." "Please?" "No," he roared, "and don't you budge or I'll jerk a knot in your tails." So we stayed put, kicking the seats, while he ducked inside. Often when he parked the car at a careless angle, we gazed in through the window and saw Mr. Sly fetching down from a shelf behind the cash register 2 green pints of Gallo wine. Father swigged one of them right there at the counter, stuffed the other in his pocket, and then out he came, a bulge in his coat, a flustered look on his red face. Because the mom and pop who ran the dump were neighbors of ours living just down the tar-blistered road, I hated them all the more for poisoning my father. I wanted to sneak in their store and smash the bottles and set fire to the place. I also hated the Gallo brothers, Ernest and Julio, whose jovial faces shone from the labels of their wine, labels I would find torn and curled when I burned the trash. I noted the Gallo brothers' address in California, and I studied the road atlas to see how far that was from Ohio, because I meant to go out there and tell Ernest and Julio what they were doing to my father, and then, if they showed no mercy, I would kill them. While growing up on the back roads and in the country schools and cramped Methodist churches of Ohio and Tennessee, I never heard the word alcoholism, never happened across it in books or magazines. In the nearby towns, there were no addiction treatment programs, no community mental health centers, no Alcoholics Anonymous chapters, no therapists. Left alone with our grievous secret, we had no way of understanding Father's drinking except as an act of will, a deliberate folly, a cruelty, a moral weakness, a sin. He drank because he chose to, pure and simple. Why our Father, so playful and competent and kind when sober, would choose to ruin himself and punish his family, we could not fathom. Our neighborhood was high on the Bible, and the Bible was hard on drunkards. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink, wrote Isaiah. The priest and the prophet reel with strong drink. They are confused with wine. They err in vision. They stumble in giving judgment, for all the tables are full of vomit. No place is without filthiness. We children had seen those foul tables at the local truck stop where the notorious boozers hung out, our father occasionally among them. Wine and new wine take away the understanding, declared the prophet Hosea. We had also seen evidence of that in our father, who could multiply 7-digit numbers in his head when sober, but when drunk could not help us with 4th grade math. Proverbs warn, do not look at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup and goes down smoothly. At the last it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. Your eyes will see strange things, and your mind will utter perverse things. Woe, woe. Dismayingly often, these biblical drunkards stirred up trouble for their own kids. Noah made fresh wine after the flood, drank too much of it, fell asleep without any clothes on, and was glimpsed in the buff by his son Ham, whom Noah promptly cursed. In one passage, it was so shocking we had to read it under the blankets with our flashlights. The patriarch Lot fell down drunk and slept with his daughters. The sins of the fathers set their children's teeth on edge. Our ministers were fond of quoting St. Paul's pronouncement that drunkards would not inherit the kingdom of God. These grave preachers assured us that the wine referred to during the Last Supper was in fact grape juice. Bible and sermons and hymns combined to give us the impression that Moses should have brought down from the mountain another stone tablet bearing the 11th commandment, "Thou shalt not drink." The scariest and most illuminating Bible story apropos of drunkards was the one about the lunatic and the swine. Matthew, Mark, and Luke each told a version of the tale. We knew it by heart. When Jesus climbed out of his boat one day, this lunatic came charging up from the graveyard, stark naked and filthy, frothing at the mouth, so violent that he broke the strongest chains. Nobody would go near him. Night and day for years, this madman had been wailing among the tombs and bruising himself with stones. Jesus took one look at him and said, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirits," for he could see that the lunatic was possessed by demons. Meanwhile, some hogs were conveniently rooting nearby. "If we have to come out," begged the demons, "at least let us go into those swine." Jesus agreed. The unclean spirits entered the hogs, and the hogs rushed straight off a cliff and plunged into a lake. Hearing the story in Sunday school, my friends thought mainly of the pigs. How big of a splash did they make? Who paid for the lost pork? But I thought of the redeemed lunatic who bathed himself and put on clothes and calmly sat at the feet of Jesus, restored, so the Bible said, to his right mind. When drunk, our Father was clearly in his wrong mind. He became a stranger as fearful to us as any graveyard lunatic, not quite frothing at the mouth, but fierce enough, quick-tempered, explosive, or else he grew maudlin and weepy, which frightened us nearly as much. In my boyhood despaired, I reasoned that maybe he wasn't to blame for turning into an ogre. Maybe, like the lunatic, he was possessed by demons. I found support for my theory when I heard liquor referred to as spirits. When the newspaper reported that somebody had been arrested for driving under the influence, and when church ladies rallied against the demon drink. If my father was indeed possessed, who would exorcise him? If he was a sinner, who would save him? If he was ill, who would cure him? If he suffered, who would ease his pain? Not ministers or doctors, for we could not bring ourselves to confide in them. Not the neighbors, for we pretended they had never seen him drunk. Not mother, who fussed and pleaded but could not budge him. Not my brother and my sister, who were only kids. That left me. It did not matter that I too was only a child, and a bewildered one at that. I could not excuse myself. On first reading a description of delirium tremens in a book on alcoholism I smuggled from the library, I thought immediately of the frothing lunatic and the frenzied swine. When I read stories or watched films about grisly metamorphosis, Dr. Jekyll becoming Mr. Hyde, the mild husband changing into a werewolf, the kindly neighbor taken over by a brutal alien, I could not help seeing my own father's mutation from sober to drunk. Even today, knowing better, I am attracted by the alcoholic theory of drink. By the demonic theory of drink. For when I recall my father's transformation, the emergence of his ugly second self, I find it easy to believe in possession by unclean spirits. We never knew which version of father would come home from work, the true or the tainted, nor could we guess how far down the slope towards cruelty he would slide. How far a man could slide we gauged by observing our back road neighbors, the out-of-work miners who had dragged their families to our corner of Ohio from the desolate hollows of Appalachia, the tight-fisted farmers, the surly mechanics that balked and the balked and broken men. There was, for example, whiskey-soaked Mr. Jenkins who beat his wife and kids so hard we could hear their screams from the road. There was Mr. Lavo, the wino, who fell asleep smoking time and again until one night his disgusted wife bundled up the children and went outside and left him in his easy chair to burn. He awoke on his own, staggered out, coughing into the yard, and pounded her flat while the children looked on and the shack turned to ash. There was the truck driver, Mr. Sampson, who tripped over his son's tricycle one night while drunk and got so mad that he jumped into his semi and drove away, shifting through the dozen gears, and he never came back. We saw the bruised children of these fathers clump onto our school bus. We saw the abandoned children huddle in the pews at church. We saw the stunned and battered mothers begging for help at our doors. Our own father never beat us, and I don't think he ever beat mother, but he threatened often. The Old Testament Yahweh was not more terrible in his wrath. Eyes blazing, voice booming, father would pull out his belt and swear to give us a whipping, but he never followed through, never needed to, because we could imagine it so vividly. He shoved us, pawed us with the back of his hand, as an irked bear might smack a cub, not to injure, just to clear a space. I can see him grabbing mother by the hair as she cowers on a chair during a nightly quarrel. He twists her neck back until she gapes up at him, and then he lifts over her skull a glass quart bottle of milk, the milk running down his forearm, and he yells at her, "Say just one more word, one goddamn word, and I'll shut you up." I fear she will prick him with her sharp tongue, but she is terrified into silence, and so am I. And the leaking bottle quivers in the air, and milk slithers through the red hair of my father's uplifted arm, and the entire scene is there to this moment. The head jerked back, the club raised. When the drink made him weepy, father would pack a bag and kiss each of his children on the head and announce from the front door that he was moving out. Where to? We demanded, fearful each time that he would leave for good, as Mr. Sampson had roared away for good in his diesel truck. Some place I won't get hounded every minute, father would answer, his jaw quivering. He stabbed a look at mother who might say, don't run into the ditch before you get there, or good riddance. And then he would slink away. Mother watched him go, with arms crossed over her chest, her face closed like the lid on a box of snakes. We children bawled. Where would he go? To the truck stop, that den of iniquity? To one of those dark, ratty flop houses in town? Would he wind up sleeping under a railroad bridge, or on a park bench, or a cardboard box, mummied in rags like the bums we had seen on our trips to Cleveland and Chicago? We bawled and bawled, wondering if he would ever come back. He always did come back, a day or a week later, but each time there was a sliver less of him. In Kafka's Metamorphosis, which opens famously with Gregor Samsa's waking up from uneasy dreams to find himself transformed into an insect, Gregor's family keep reassuring themselves that things will be just fine again when he comes back to us. Each time alcohol transformed our father, we held out the same hope that he would really and truly come back to us, our authentic father, the tender and playful, competent man, and then all things would be fine. We had grounds for such hope. After his weepy departures and chapfallen returns, he would sometimes go weeks, even months, without drinking. Those were glad times. Joy banged inside my ribs. Every day without the furtive glint of bottles, every meal without a fight, every bedtime without sobs encouraged us to believe that such bliss might go on forever. Mother was fooled by just such a hope all during the 40-odd years she knew this Greeley Ray Sanders. Soon after she met him in a Chicago delicatessen on the eve of World War II and fell for his butter-melting Mississippi drawl and his wavy red hair, she learned that he drank heavily, but then so did a lot of men. She would soon coax or scold him into breaking the nasty habit. She would point out to him how ugly and foolish it was, this bleary drinking, and then he would quit. He refused to quit during their engagement, however, still refused during their first years of marriage, refused until my sister came along. The shock of fatherhood sobered him, and he remained sober through my birth at the end of the war and right on through until we moved in 1951 to the Ohio Arsenal, that paradise of bombs. Like all places that make a business of death, the Arsenal had more than its share of alcoholics and drug addicts and other variety of escape artists. There I turned 6, started school, and woke into a child's flickering awareness just in time to see my father begin sneaking swigs in the garage. He sobered up again for most of a year at the height of the Korean War to celebrate the birth of my brother. But aside from that dry spell, his only breaks from drinking before I graduated from high school were just long enough to raise and then dash our hopes. Then, during the fall of my senior year, the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when it seemed that the nightly explosions at the mutinous dump and the nightly rages in our household might spread to engulf the globe, father collapsed. His liver, kidneys, and heart all conked out. The doctors saved him, but only by a hair. He stayed in the hospital for weeks, going through a withdrawal so terrible that mother would not let us visit him. If he wanted to kill himself, the doctors solemnly warned him, all he had to do was hit the bottle again. One binge would finish him. Father must have believed them, for he stayed dry for the next 15 years. It was an answer to prayer, mother said. It was a miracle. I believe it was a reflex of fear, which he sustained over the years through courage and pride. He knew a man could die from drink, for his brother Roscoe had. We children never laid eyes on doomed Uncle Roscoe, but in the stories mother told us, he became a fairy tale figure like a boy who took the wrong turning in the woods and was gobbled up by the wolf. The 15-year dry spell came to an end with Father's retirement in the spring of 1978. Like many men, he gave up his identity along with his job. One day he was a boss at the factory with a brass plate on his door and a reputation to uphold. The next day he was a nobody at home. He and Mother were leaving Ontario, the last of the many places to which his job had carried them, and they were moving to a new house in Mississippi, his childhood stomping grounds. As a boy in Mississippi, Father sold Coca-Cola during dances, while the moonshiners peddled their brew in the parking lot. As a young blade, he fought in bars and the ring, seeking a state Golden Gloves championship. He gambled at poker, hunted pheasants, raced motorcycles and cars, played semi-professional baseball, and along with all his buddies in the Black Cat Saloon behind the cotton gin in the woods, he drank. It was a perilous youth to dream of recovering. After his final day of work, Mother drove on ahead with a car full of begonias and violets, while Father stayed behind to oversee the packing. When the van was loaded, the sweaty movers broke open a six-pack and offered him a beer. "Let's drink to retirement," they crowed. "Let's drink to freedom, to fishing, hunting, loafing. Let's drink to a guy who's going home." Or at least I imagine some such words, for that is all I can do, imagine. And I see my father's hand trembling in midair as he thinks about the 15 sober years and about the doctor's warning, and he tells himself, "God damn it, I'm a free man, and why can't a free man drink one beer after a lifetime of hard work?" And I see his arm reaching, his fingers closing, the can tilting to his lips. I even supply a label for the beer, a swaggering brand that promises on television to deliver the essence of life. I watch the amber liquid pour down his throat, the alcohol steal into his blood, the key turn in his brain. Soon after my parents moved back to Father's treacherous stomping grounds, my wife and I visited them in Mississippi with our 5-year-old daughter. Mother had been too distraught to warn me about the return of the demons, so when I climbed out of the car that bright July morning and saw my father napping in the hammock, I felt uneasy, for in all his years of being sober, I had never known him to sleep in daylight. Then he lurched upright, blinked his bloodshot eyes, and greeted us in a syrupy voice. I was hurled back helpless into childhood. "What's the matter with Pawpaw?" asked my daughter. "Nothing," I said, "nothing." Like a child again, I pretended not to see him in his stupor. Behind my phony smile, I grieved. On that visit and on a few that remained before his death, once again I found bottles in the workbench, bottles in the woods. Again his hands shook too much for him to run a saw, to make his precious miniature furniture, to drive straight down back roads. Again he wound up in the ditch, in the hospital, in jail, in treatment centers. Again he shouted and wept. Again he lied. "I never touched a drop," he swore. "Your mother's making it up." I no longer fancied I could reason with the men whose names I found on the bottles, Jim Beam, Jack Daniels, nor did I hope to save my father by burning down a store. I was able now to press the cold statistics about alcoholism against the ache of memory. 10 million victims, 15 million, 20, and yet, in spite of my age, I reacted in the same blind way as I had in childhood, ignoring biology, forgetting numbers, vainly seeking to erase through my efforts whatever drove him to drink. I worked on their place 12 and 16 hours a day in the swelter of Mississippi summers, digging ditches, running electrical wires, planting trees, mowing grass, building sheds, as though what nagged at him was some list of chores, as though by taking his worries on my shoulders I could redeem him. I was flung back into boyhood, acting as though my father would not drink himself to death if only I were perfect. I failed of perfection. He succeeded in dying. To the end, he considered himself not sick but sinful. "Do you want to kill yourself?" I asked him. "Why not?" he answered. "Why the hell not? What's there to save?" To the end, he would not speak about his feelings, would not or could not give a name to the beast that was devouring him. In silence, he went rushing off the cliff. Unlike the biblical swine, however, he left behind a few of the demons to haunt his children. Life with him and the loss of him twisted us into shapes that will be familiar to other sons and daughters of alcoholics. My brother became a rebel, my sister retreated into shyness. I played the stalwart and dutiful son who would hold the family together if my father was unstable. I would be a rock. If he squandered money on drink, I would pinch every penny. If he wept when drunk, and only when drunk, I would not let myself weep at all. If he roared at the Little League umpire for calling my pitches balls, I would throw nothing but strikes. Watching him flounder and rage, I came to dread the loss of control. I would go through life without making anyone mad. I vowed never to put in my mouth or veins any chemical that would banish my everyday self. I would never make a scene, never lash out at the ones I loved, never hurt a soul. Through hard work, relentless work, I would achieve something dazzling in the classroom, on the basketball floor, in the science lab, in the pages of books, and my achievement would distract the world's eye from his humiliation. I would become a worthy sacrifice, and the smoke of my burning would please God. It is far easier to recognize these twists in my character than to undo them. Work has become an addiction for me as drink was an addiction to my father. Knowing this, my daughter gave me a play card for the wall. Workaholic, it said. The labor is endless and futile, for I can no more redeem myself through work than I could redeem my father. I still panic in the face of other people's anger because his drunken temper was so terrible. I shrink from causing sadness or disappointment even to strangers, as though I were still concealing the family shame. I still notice every twitch of emotion in the faces around me, having learned as a child to read the weather in faces, and I blame myself for their least pang of unhappiness or anger. In certain moods, I blame myself for everything. Guilt burns like acid in my veins. I am moved to write these pages now because my own son at the age of 10 is taking on himself the griefs of the world, and in particular the griefs of his father. He tells me that when I am gripped by sadness, he feels responsible. He feels there must be something he can do to spring me from depression to fix my life. And that crushing sense of responsibility is exactly what I felt at the age of 10 in the face of my father's drinking. My son wonders if I, too, am possessed. I write, therefore, to drag into the light what eats at me, the fear, the guilt, the shame, so that my own children may be spared. I still shy away from nightclubs, from bars, from parties where the solvent is alcohol. My friends puzzle over this, but it is no more peculiar than for a man to shy away from the lion's den after seeing his father torn apart. I took my own first drink at the age of 21, half a glass of Burgundy. I knew the odds of my becoming an alcoholic were 4 times higher than for the sons of non-alcoholic fathers, so I sipped warily. I still do, once a week. Perhaps a glass of wine, a can of beer, nothing stronger, nothing more. I listen for the turning of a key in my brain. Okay, that concludes Under the Influence. I want you to think about, again, your figures of speech, metaphor, simile, illusion, and personification. There's lots and lots of these four figures of speech present here in this story. I also want you thinking along the lines of theme. We talked about how we're dealing with the theme of metamorphosis or change, right? So how does that come into play into this essay? And you're going to want to deal with that in the theme section of your assignment. Notice that there is an allusion here to The Metamorphosis by Kafka, the book that you've been reading in 2341. So you are now ready to get started on your assignments.